Hello and welcome to How Could We, a podcast by EIT Climate KIC, where we ask ourselves, how could we achieve a climate resilient, inclusive and beautiful future for all? I'm your host, Anne-Sophie Garrigou. We created this space to allow for a series of conversations about building hope, curiosity and excitement for a just and desirable future that is compatible with our planetary boundaries. Here we talk to people who inspire us, and we are putting transformative solutions into practice. In our previous series, we talked about many topics, including the need to redefine development funding, what it means to practice radical collaboration, and the power of art to reinvigorate the climate movement. Now, this new series is all about cities. We'll talk about the role of community engagement in cities' transformation, about the challenges and opportunities for collaboration between stakeholders, and about the dialogue happening between industries and cities to reach climate-neutral goals. In this special episode, I will talk to EIT Climate KIC CEO, Dr. Kirsten Dunlop, about why we have chosen to work in and with cities, how cities embody the idea of systems transformation, what we've learned from our cities' work that is helpful when we work with regions, nations, industries, and many other stakeholders. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hello, Kirsten. Thank you for joining me today. Welcome to How Could We?
Hello, Anne-Sophie. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk together.
So, Kirsten, during this whole episode, we're going to talk about systems transformation in cities. Can you define maybe in a few words what we at Climate KIC call systems transformation applied to the city context?
We think of systems transformation as an effort to intervene on a number of different elements simultaneously that are engaging, if you like, the individual elements that make up urban life, living for people in cities, whether that's the way in which we build buildings or the way in which we design the flow of traffic or the type of forms of transport and mobility, or the way in which we arrange green spaces. The relationships among those elements, so the way how roads are designed affects the quality of life in houses, or how houses are designed shapes the way in which transport happens, whether people have to commute long distances or not. So the individual elements, the relationships among the elements, and the rules that govern those relationships. So there may, for example, be explicit rules about what it is that a city requires or doesn't require, or explicit rules that are historic or future. There might also be tacit rules. Often cities are constructed in ways whereby the access to better quality of living is tacitly given to those who have more spending power, and access to poorer quality of living ends up residing with people who have less spending power, who have longer commute times and so on. So all of those elements constitute systems. They are what make up systems and the way systems work. When Climate KIC, when we're talking about changing the way in which life happens in an urban context, we're talking about intervening on all of those elements simultaneously, because the way they interact is what constitutes the way a city is. And then there's one critical element, and that is the way people think. Their mindset, their sense of self, their sense of who they are, why they are, what underpins that, whether it's conscious or subconscious, the identity that makes up what it means to be living in Madrid, living in Paris, living in Amsterdam, or living in Krakow. All of those elements are relevant and needed when it comes to bringing about transformation. And in our world, our job is all about bringing about the kind of transformations we need to enable people to live well, but live within planetary boundaries. And that means living sustainably when it comes to the way we use building materials, the way we travel about, the way we dress, the food we access. And cities are absolutely at the center of that transformation.
Thank you. Yeah, in this series of episodes, we're going to try to tackle a few of those elements of the system. So I think it was important to place that here. So EIT Climate KIC has been working with cities for over a decade, initially through initiatives like the Climathon, which is a global hackathon that unites citizens, innovators, and experts to develop solutions for local climate challenges within, I think it's 24 hours. And more recently, we're still doing the Climaton, but more recently we shifted towards also driving deeper systemic transformation in cities through what we call our place-based program, such as the deep demonstrations. And those programs are large-scale collaborative projects that are aimed at accelerating systemic change by testing, showcasing innovative solutions to complex climate issues in real-world context. So can you maybe share what initially inspired or what made Climate KIC want to focus on cities as a crucial area for systems transformation? Was there a key moment or realization that cities would be at the heart of this effort?
A large part of the reason why we focus on cities has to do with addressing the scale and the nature of the challenge we face when we're talking about addressing climate change, and more importantly, thinking of climate change not in a narrow understanding of this is about replacing, substituting fossil fuels, but this is about a much broader understanding of what it is that we're facing, which includes our impact of our ways of living on biodiversity, but it also includes the way in which our habits and practices of social and economic systems, economic practices, are creating injustices and inequalities that then force people to use materials and resources in ways that are completely unsustainable. So it's a holistic understanding. In the heart of that, the greatest concentrations of emissions, of pollution, and of injustice in social living is cities. Cities have over 70% of emissions of CO2 equivalent emissions in the world, but they also constitute the greatest concentration potentially, or future concentration, of stranded assets as climate change effects begin to really weigh in and really kind of wreak havoc, whether that's sea level rise that is leading to flooding, which is already happening in Malaysia and Indonesia, or whether it's heat islands and heat effects that make cities completely uninhabitable, unlivable, or whether it's the breakdown in fabric, in materials, in energy concentrations, and so on. In a world of a growing human population, still massively growing and still increasing emissions, intervening in cities gives us the greatest possible leverage point to turn around and to bend the curves of emissions and turn around the way in which human civilizations are imagining to live, practicing living, and kind of making a difference, making an impact on the planet. If we can enact in urban contexts what it means to live within planetary boundaries, so we have a much greater hope and possibility if we can work with the scale of transformation at the aggregate scales that cities offer, that are also the aggregate scales of emissions that we need to tackle. But there's something else which is much, much more about culture, identity, meaning, and purpose. Cities are the spaces and the places where social life, the life of being in human community, in society and economy, are played out. They're the places where they're enacted politically. They're the places where the economics, the real economics are aggregated materially. They're the places where we enact our relationships with one another, both formally and informally. So they're immensely important from the perspective of beginning to understand how we can shift our sense of self. If we need to tackle climate change and to tackle, above all, the transformation of humans that is needed to tackle climate change, actually cities are the most meaningful places in which we can do that, the places where the transformation becomes real. You may perhaps perceive climate change effects in forests, in wildfires at the moment, or in storms, or in sea level rise more than you see it in cities, but transformation becomes real in cities. And it's the places where we know we can see it is possible for people to start to intuitively understand what, for example, systems change means, because we know that things are connected. So it's much more possible intuitively to engage on that idea of working on multiple elements simultaneously in a city context.
Can you maybe tell us a few key lessons that EIT Climate KIC learned from working with cities that could be applied to a broader context? And we can talk about regions, for instance, but also nations and industries. How can we ensure that those successful strategies developed in cities are effectively scaled and adapted to different environments?
So some of the elements that are very, very important in terms of what we have learned is about enablement. One of the challenges of working on climate is that it is an inherently normative exercise, i.e., there's a sense of what is it that needs to be done and what differences need to be made or be affected, whether that's a reduction in CO2 emissions or it's kind of moving to a set of lifestyles that we know to be less damaging to the planet, whether that's with respect to diets or less damaging to ourselves with respect to perhaps kind of more physical activity and less sitting in cars. But it comes with a lot of requirements or expectations that are almost preset. They create very little space for action. One of the biggest lessons of working with and partnering with cities is to enable the flexibility and the agility of exploring possibilities and alternatives, what I would call options, possibilities of choice that lead to different outcomes. And there isn't an inherent knowledge or understanding of exactly how some of those choices might play out. The participation in making those choices and the learning from trying them. And all of that requires creating a space for flexible, integrated experimentation, demonstration, for trialing, for discussion and debate through, for example, citizen assemblies or citizen groups, placing citizens very much at the heart of action, but also then through the process of trying and seeing what happens. Where do unforeseen obstacles show up? What is it that we need to shift around our expectations or our habits or our practices or our knowledge of what has been in the past? So there's a lot of learning around empowering and enabling cities to lead that work and to create the spaces of leadership for some of the decisioning to be emergent. So if we think about, for example, the work that we supported for years in Amsterdam, which was a community-led initiative to convert large parts of the red light district into what they called the green light district. A lot of that was a process of negotiation over time with building owners, with the residents, with people who were practicing in the red light district, to come around to how is this going to benefit us? What options do we have? What choices would we want to make? And then learning over time, as the outcomes became apparent, how would you want to scale this? How does it make a difference to us? What choices do we want to make in terms of how we shape it? So that's one critical lesson. And we see it now in the extremely ambitious and bold transformation initiatives that we're leading on behalf of the European Commission, the Horizon Europe Cities mission, where you have a commitment of 112 cities to decarbonize completely by 2030. One of the biggest challenges is to get out of the way and help those cities help themselves, to really create a space for cities to determine how they're going to do that. Another key lesson is around multi-level governance. We know that this kind of process of transformation works if you are able to involve the voices of those at all sorts of different scales and levels in a process, in a carefully supported, orchestrated process of decisioning, of co-decisioning, of co-determination, and of co-governance. So a shared sense of responsibility, a shared sense of accountability, but also genuine participation and access to decisioning. That's very difficult because most of the ways in which governance is designed in the world has very little space for that idea of distributed, kind of multi-layer, complex, multi-actor systems. Learning to do that is incredibly important. But even then, much of what we know needs to happen in cities, or much of what cities are seeking to solve for, requires other actors at the table. So, for example, within the European City Construct and the City Mission Programme, it's not going to be possible for cities to decarbonize at the speed and the scale that that programme is committed to doing without bringing to the same table relatively early industry. Big industry, small and medium enterprise. In other words, all of the businesses that need to supply alternative materials that are green, or need to supply the shifts in logistics that need to happen within cities, or need to be able to comply or participate in the material changes that cities are going to need to make. So thinking ahead to anticipate, we can't wait for action plans and investment plans to be drawn up and then go to industry and say, this is what we've got to do, because there will not be the time to be able to address those initiatives. And there's also a limit into knowledge. Cities don't know what they don't know about what's possible materially. Businesses have no idea that this is actually happening, and that therefore they need to ready supply and materials, but begin to think in terms of partnerships. we need to really anticipate, look around corners. What is it that we're going to need to have in dialogue now to make some of these processes possible?
Yes, you just mentioned a few things that are reflecting on what this series of episodes will be. You mentioned Net Zero Cities, and we'll have an interview with Thomas Osdoba, the director of Net Zero Cities, and the mayor of Stavanger, which is a city in Norway that is participating in Net Zero Cities program. We'll have another episode on community engagement, where we'll talk about some of the new urban Bauhaus projects that we're working on, and then we'll have an episode on the dialogue that you just mentioned between industries and cities. So thank you for kind of framing this series of episodes. Now, I wanted to ask you about looking ahead, looking into the future, knowing that 70% of the population is going to live in cities. How do you see the role of cities even evolving, even getting greater, bigger in the global fight against climate change? Because right now, when we go to international forums like the COP, the Climate UN conference, it's more about maybe nations. There are new responsibilities or powers that cities might need to assume to effectively contribute to the sustainable future.
I think we need to put into context what we know enough about and understand, and therefore understand something of in the ways in which the world will evolve, no matter what we do, because of a number of locked-in global warming effects. Cities will be carrying vast numbers of people fleeing from the effects of climate change, which means the cities that we're talking about now for our world now are only half of the story, because the cities we now have are cities that belong to and are characterized by decades of a relatively stable set of circumstances, hundreds or centuries actually. So imagine cities as much larger aggregations of formal communities in their current configuration and massive informal communities of people fleeing to find some alternative or some access to food sources, to water, and so on. There's cities in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America that we know have plans for, particularly on the African continent, enormous expansion and construction plans. Cities like Lagos that are going to be multiplying by orders of magnitude in size and construction. So huge metropolises with significant components of both formal and informal community structuring and living. That leads us towards needing to think, and probably having the best possible chance of survival by doing so, in terms of effectively city-states, going back almost to the idea of city-states, where cities, they have market power, they have enormous convening power, they have enormous economic subsistence, economic resilience power, if they can use it. So if you think about what we now talk about in terms of, say, energy communities, where streets or neighborhoods or household or kind of constellations of households set up renewable energy sources, solar panels, wind, whatever, and create their own autonomous, self-reliant energy system. Cities are massive aggregate forms of that. Something similar is going to need to happen in materials, where we know we do not have sufficient materials to effect all of the transitions we need into renewable energy sources or into sustainable sources of water and food and waste and so on. So we're going to need to think about materials communities where the reuse recycling is stewarded and constructed at scales that are meaningful and useful. And historically, for hundreds and thousands of years, peoples have concentrated around communities that we have otherwise called cities. That's where the notion of civilization, of civis comes from. So I think there is very significant change that cities will be at the heart of. How to lead that change, how to design that change, how to not fall into it accidentally, but to do so in thoughtful, anticipatory, generous, caring, and tolerant ways. I was involved in the summer conference of the annual conference of the Net Zero Cities, of the city's mission this year, listening to the mayor of Leuven, with whom we have worked for years, Mohammed Ridwani, talking about not only the importance of really focusing on capacity building, of securing finance, of creating the kind of political and policy context that is conducive to transformative change, but above all, focusing on attracting people of all walks of life, of a capacity, of vision, of a willingness to work together. And he really focused on the fact that we shouldn't just focusing on worrying about de-risking capital investment. We should be talking about de-risking leadership for people who are taking risks to get things done on the ground and making sure that change is happening fast enough to keep those people motivated and keep them staying in the places where they can make such a difference. And I think that's one of the fascinating things about how do cities become the places where you can get the most done with greatest effect and with the greatest opportunity to balance out the elements that are needed between justice, living sustainably, and living well. That's possibly the greatest opportunity that cities represent.
Thank you. And that brings just two thoughts here quickly. One thing, I wanted to invite people to listen maybe to the second episode of our first season, because we talked to Siaka William, who was working at Dalberg at the time. And we talked about the opportunities and challenges of building a sustainable mass timber market in East Africa, which I think was really interesting in all the discussion we're having here on cities. And the second thing I was thinking is on this reflection from the mayor of Leuven. One thing we're going to talk about in our first episode on community engagement, as you said, the cities, the way cities are now, it's going to be very different in a few years because of the climate migration, because of conflicts in the world. And so I think talking about citizen engagement can exclude actually a lot of the population. And right now there is a huge emphasis on not only talking, but about community engagement rather than citizen engagement, because a lot of people who are going to live in cities are not going to be considered as citizens, in the sense that they're not able to participate in, for instance, voting on things like this. So there is a reflection right now on cities on how to include this population that it doesn't have to be marginalized, but that is not considered as citizens. And I think this is a really interesting reflection.
Well, and how to really challenge some of our assumptions around what citizenship constitutes, because for centuries, it has constituted the relationship between property ownership and compliance with legal frameworks that govern property ownership and secure ownership. If cities, for example, become the spaces and the places where we experiment with really shifting notions of ownership, you open up whole new sets of possibilities also for how to include or widen up a sense of participation, citizenship, to something which is not constrained in models that are simply not fit for purpose.
Exactly. So I think this is really, really interesting conversation. So thank you for opening that. Now I wanted to go back a little bit to Climate KIC, and I was wondering if you can tell us a few words about the long-term vision and kind of strategic goals of Climate KIC, and how do these goals align with the broader global climate targets, and is there any specific outcomes that we're striving for in the next 5-10 years?
Yes, there are many answers to that. One is, so very specifically, as an organization coming from European origins, responsible for one of the boldest urban transformation commitments in the world, we are working to help 112 cities decarbonize by 2030, and that on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions alone, so direct and indirect, not the kind of long, broader context of, say, food systems and so on, that equivalates to 0.7 gigatons of emissions avoided by 2040 if we can be successful. The point of that initiative is not to stop with those 112. In fact, what really matters about that initiative is contagion, is to create precedent, to open up possibilities, to show that it's possible, to create the kind of novel partnerships amongst cities, amongst leaders, amongst communities, and between cities and the private sector to massively accelerate by orders of magnitude what thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of other cities are doing. So for us, one very significant goal of the next 5 to 10 years is to do everything possible to enable that initiative to succeed in accelerating learning and establishing the precedent and demonstration possibility that it needs to do, so that hundreds and thousands of other cities in Europe can follow suit and, in fact, accelerate with much faster transformation curves. We, in terms of our objective as an organization, adding up what we're working on between cities, regions in Europe and across the rest of the world, we have an explicit target of 400 plus cities, regions and countries getting to a point of transformative decarbonization, and to 70 million citizens being able to live in a thriving, safe, resilient and climate and sustainable environment. But we are involved in other initiatives because we are a drop in the ocean compared to what needs to be done. And one of the initiatives that we are engaged in is something called the Systemic Climate Action Collaborative, which is an initiative of 15 organizations who are all implementing in different ways, very diverse organizations, choosing to address something that is holding all of us back, which is that we compete. We compete with each other to fundraise, we compete with each other to establish credibility, and that competition is a friction cost we cannot afford in this century. So we are committing, and we have committed to stop working like that, to really pool our resources, our complementary capabilities, to minimize any loss of effort, and to work together towards much larger order outcomes, which in this case are a collective commitment to 40 gigatons by 2040 of emissions reduced or avoided, which is 10% of the 1.5 degree aligned remaining carbon budget in 2023. And to 1 billion people living with resilience to climate impact in conditions that are favorable to prosperous societies. If we don't shift the root cause problem around extractive economics, we can't shift anything. And massive shifts in the enabling conditions, for example, addressing poverty and inequality in the context where we're working, so that we can create the foundations for living differently.
So, Kirsten, what would a beautiful, just and climate resilient future look like for you? And how do you see this vision being realized through the work that we're doing now?
Well, I just came back from spending a little time with my family in Italy and Tuscany. And one of the things that will be sitting with me for a number of years is the experience of walking through the beech forest on the top of Monte Amiata, which is an architectural space in the sense that they're untouched beech forests, and it is an environment of extraordinary, generous, refreshing, regenerative, restorative space, constructed by the architecture of trees, enormously kind of open, shaded, pleasant, beautiful. You can feel everything changing in your mind, in your body, in your soul. And I think of a future where more and more of the world that we inhabit feels like that and is made like that. It is a space of natural materials, natural contexts, natural shapes, natural design. It brings to life what it means to use the idea of an ecological civilization. I would love to be living in cities that are rewilded to the point where actually they are something that is as close as an approximation to what we can do with the very best of our intelligence, our collective intelligence. There are real possibilities for us to create something magical. I don't think we're going to have an awful lot of choice, but I think we have a real opportunity to create something that is beautiful in multidimensional ways. How are we going to do that? I think we are working and living at a time where that feels a long way off and possibly feels like a fantasy book or a fairy tale. But on the other hand, we're working on a daily basis with people who are putting everything they have into ways of working differently with one another, and of anticipating and allowing for the fact that nothing happens according to plan, that you're constantly having to adjust and be flexible and learn and reinvest that learning in continuing to change and work with the circumstances. And I think our role is to create the conditions for that, to actively orchestrate, to encourage, to celebrate, and to invest in creating the conditions for that hope-filled, hope-fueled creative possibility. Because the more we invest in that side of things, the more we come to believe and feel that it is possible to change ourselves in ways that are enjoyable and in ways that are beneficial and in ways that really bring to life the fact that this transformation is the greatest opportunity we all have to create a world in which we live well.
Well, thank you so much, Kirsten, for sharing your reflection, for your honesty about the difficulties that we have in front of us, and for reminding us about the possibilities of building this more sustainable, just, and beautiful future. Thank you so much for joining us today on How Could We?
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for listening to this special episode with EIT Climate KIC CEO, Dr. Kirsten Dunlop. In the next few weeks, we'll release 3 episodes about cities transformation. We'll talk about community engagement, about the importance of the dialogue between industries and cities, and about what radical collaboration looks like in practice when it comes to working in cities. This is all about bridging the gap between climate ambition and reality. If you don't want to miss the next episodes, you can follow the podcast wherever you listen to it and follow Climate KIC, that's Climate-KIC on social media. You can also drop us an email at media@climate-kic.org and rate the podcast 5 stars so more people find out about it. This podcast was produced by Barbara Mendes-George. Thank you all for listening and see you soon.